for maybe 15 or 20 minutes or so, however long it takes. And then if there's any questions or anyone wants to contribute to the discussion, that would be great. So my name's Dr. Alex Armitage. I'm a senior registrar in paediatrics, and I currently work in the paediatric intensive care unit in Southampton. My career as a children's doctor began just over 10 years ago in South Africa. My wife and I worked in a hospital in KwaZulu-Natal in the eastern part of South Africa. And working with my professional colleagues there in the government, we witnessed child death on a regular basis. And I remember sitting in our child mortality meetings, which happened on a weekly basis, and we would sit together as a group of doctors working in the hospital and discuss the case of every child death that there was in our unit. And on a good week, we'd have maybe 3 cases to discuss, and on a bad week, we'd have maybe more than 6 or 7. And there was a common thread running through all of those child deaths, and that thread was malnutrition. And back in 2009, the area that we were working in was one of the areas of South Africa that was suffering most heavily from the burden of HIV disease. And it was that condition, HIV, that through a kind of associated TB epidemic, that was driving the rates of malnutrition, which was causing so many deaths. And after years of work by my colleagues in the government Department of Health in that province and in other provinces in South Africa, and also in other parts of Africa, which is the continent that was most heavily hit by the HIV epidemic, that disease has, whilst there's still a lot more work to be done, that disease has by and large, particularly in the children's population, been relatively brought under control. And it's great that we have seen a reduction in deaths related to HIV in children over the last 10 years. But that's what is a victory seems now rather hollow when faced with the spectre of HIV disease. Do I need the microphone, or should I? Could you test it? Yeah. Sorry. Is it on? Yeah. 1, 2. Can you hear? Is that better? So today I want to talk to you about how climate breakdown, if unmitigated, will lead to crop failure and food insecurity, and how if we don't act now, famine is going to lead to a downturn in survival rates for young children, particularly those under 5 and infants under 1, and how famine will lead eventually to unimaginable human suffering. So, going back to prehistory, human beings' ability to produce calories has always been a foundation upon which societies have depended and been able to thrive. So the invention of farming allowed humans to settle in particular geographical areas and gave human beings spare time which could be used to develop and organise societies. And as the proportion of time that human beings have spent producing food has decreased, so have we as a species been able to invent machines, medicine, art, culture, and all the things that enrich and give meaning to our lives. Not that food doesn't give meaning to our lives, but all the other things as well. Throughout history, as societies have been periodically been threatened with food shortages, so have we developed more sophisticated ways to produce food and provide us with food security. And there was a man called Norman Borlaug, who is an American agrologist, so an expert in agriculture. And he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work in being involved in the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was a revolution in agriculture, which predominantly led to massive benefits in South Asia and China. And the Green Revolution was a combination of production of new dwarf seed varieties, which were which gave much higher yields than traditional crops, as well as new pesticides and petrochemical fertilizers. And together those three things meant that human beings were able to produce massively increased quantities of calories of food. And the reason why Norman Borlaug was given the Nobel Peace Prize is because at that time, particularly in India, there were recurrent famines. And so his work in contributing to food security was said by commentators at the time to have prevented the deaths of 1 billion people. And that's why he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And today we continue to have advancements in food technology and agricultural technology, most recently with genetically modified crops and other technologies. And these have all given security to our global population. Currently, 2/3 of all of our human calorific intake depends on just 4 crops: wheat, rice, maize and soybeans. But now, in 2019, and looking forward to the next decades, we face rapid global heating, and even modern advancements in agriculture will not be able to keep up with the degree of temperature rise. So according to analysis that was done in 2017, for each degree of temperature rise, wheat production decreases by 6%, rice by 3.2%, maize, which is the predominant crop in Africa where I was working, decreases by 7.4%, and soybeans reduce their production by 3.1%. And so when you put this into context of global warming of 2 or 3 degrees, you're looking at up to 20-30% decrease in food productions, but that's only looking at average temperature increases across the globe. And we know that in many areas of food production, particularly in the global south, those areas where food is produced are forecast to have a much higher than 2 or 3 degrees rise. So the global average will be 2 or 3 degrees or more if we don't do anything about climate change. But particular areas in the middle of continents will suffer much higher global average temperatures. And so putting that into the context of food security, then you begin to realise how vulnerable we are as a global population to famine. So in human societies with food scarcity, it's always the most vulnerable who suffer the most. And children's bodies have the least resilience to shortage of calories. So what I was treating when I worked in South Africa was what the World Health Organization, WHO, calls severe acute malnutrition, which is often shortened to SAM or SAM. And this happens when a normally well-growing child suddenly begins to suffer from a shortage of food without time for adaptation to a low-calorie environment. So when food scarcity begins to bite, first the child's fat reserves are used up before the child's muscles start to become wasted. And you often see children with a lack of muscle bulk. It also affects the heart muscle as well, so it increases the child's risk of developing heart failure when put under pressure of increased fluid load, which we sometimes do when we're treating infections. Lack of protein in the child's body causes skin breakdown, leading to chronic sores and hair that's sparse. And one of the clinical signs of severe acute malnutrition in children is called easy pluckability, which sounds really harsh, but it's very easy to pull a child's hair out when they're severely, acutely malnourished. Levels of albumin, which is a protein that's produced by the body, which circulates in the bloodstream, which has the effect of keeping fluid drawn into the blood vessels. Levels of albumin are low in severe acute malnutrition, causing fluid to leak out into the tissues, which causes swelling of the hands and feet and a characteristic swelling of the face, which used to be called kwashiorkor before the terminology was updated. And levels of immune proteins fall in the child's body, leaving a child really vulnerable to infection. And it's infection that is often the precipitating factor behind children dying. So most children who die of malnutrition die of a short diarrheal or a respiratory illness. And it's very difficult to treat acute malnutrition. it's not just a question of giving the child food to catch up, because often giving suddenly high quantities of calories can exacerbate things, because it draws the blood supply towards the gut and can cause disruption and lack of balance in the sugar and salt levels of the blood, and can make infection worse. So the priority when treating these children is to prevent infection, so we always start antibiotics as a matter of urgency, and then you have to pay close attention to the salt and sugar levels in the child's bloodstream. And once the child's weight has stabilised with very cautious feeding, then you can start catch-up feeding. And eventually, children often survive, but severe acute malnutrition is one of the most deadly forms of malnutrition, and depending on where it's treated and how it's treated, it's got a mortality rate of up to 20%. And it was really heartbreaking to see young children coming into hospital and dying of malnutrition associated with TB and HIV. And I just remember very well having to have horrible discussions with mothers telling them that their children were dying. And in that context, also with the death of the child came often for the mother a new diagnosis of HIV, which she wasn't aware of. So it was very difficult to have to explain all of this horrible information in such a context of despair. But it's not just the vulnerable that are, as in vulnerable children that are at risk of death from famine, because famine is also associated with violence. My father-in-law always told me that people never fight when their bellies are full, and I think that's a really interesting, that's a very interesting thing that he said and hypothesis. And speak to somebody the other day about the Rwandan genocide. They were talking about an analysis that was done looking into where the violence first broke out, and somebody found that there was a high correlation between areas of food insecurity and famine and the places where the violence was first triggered. When I was a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion in the last rebellion in April, I got a distraught phone call from a British person from Zimbabwean origin who was asking Extinction Rebellion to publicise a request for funds to provide relief for victims of Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. And this person was telling me that there were massive food shortages because crops had been wiped out. And in that situation of food scarcity, the government was prioritising food supplies to areas of the country that had voted for the political party that was in power, and areas that had voted for the opposition were not being given food. And so I think it's a really sort of dramatic picture of how food insecurity can lead to sectarian conflict, as it did in Rwanda, as it did in Mozambique more recently. So we often talk in Extinction Rebellion about how climate change is threatening human beings and human life, but we don't actually think about the mechanisms of how it's going to happen. And I think that food insecurity and famine is one of the major mechanisms, and I hope that I've sort of given a little bit of a flavour of the kind of reality of what it's like to live in an area where there's lots of malnutrition, and it's not a nice situation to be in. As a doctor on the malnutrition ward, it's well known that children who are malnourished are not happy children. Normally working as a paediatrician, it's a wonderful job because children get better quickly, and then there's lots of smiling and laughter. But working in the malnutrition ward was not a nice situation. Often mothers bringing their malnourished children in got criticised by nurses for not having looked after them properly. And there was a lot of cynicism with the way that my colleagues often talked about children with malnutrition. People called them a SAM and used to make jokes about mobile phones, Samsung, and other words beginning with SAM. And I found it all quite unsavoury, but this is the reality of working in a situation where you see death on a regular basis and people become cynical and hardened towards it. And I also remember discussions with some of my white South African colleagues who used to listen to this talk and then turn to me and say, look at these nurses, the majority of whom were black, and say, they don't even care about their own people. And so I think it's a really good illustration of how often we don't stand back and look at the bigger picture as to why people are suffering, and we just focus on the here and now. So I think where we are now in terms of 2019 and the threats that we're facing because of climate change, we're finding ourselves at a tipping point in the course of human history. You look back at all of the great people in the world in our history who've created change for the better, the likes of Gandhi and Mandela, Toussaint Louverture, and Martin Luther King. And I have no doubt that they would have given anything to be alive right now, because I think this is the most critical tipping point that human history has ever faced. And we've got a crisis of leadership in the world. We've got our world leaders who are tearing down the Amazon, putting up borders, and encouraging and exacerbating the emissions of fossil fuels in the fossil economy. So that burden of leadership, I think, falls to us, and I think that's why it's great that so many people are here today on the streets, and we're telling the truth, and we're pushing and leading our brothers and sisters in this country and in all other countries around the world to make change and to stand up for change. And finally, I want to go back to my story of fighting against the HIV epidemic in South Africa, because that was also a story of government inaction. Very early on in the course of the HIV epidemic, it became clear that this was a really significant threat to people in South Africa. But yet the government at that time in South Africa had a AIDS denialist approach, and they denied that HIV was causing this syndrome of immune deficiency, which was beginning to cause so many deaths. And there was about a 3-year delay in the rollout of effective treatments for HIV, during which time the government focused on providing messages of personal action, such as the ABC approach, to abstain, to be faithful to your sexual partner, and to compromise. But what really changed the government was political action. So there was a group called the Treatment Action Campaign that was set up, which involved civil society and ordinary people getting onto the street and causing a fuss. And 3 years too late, finally, antiretrovirals, the medicines that were effective against HIV, were released. And it was 3 years before I went to work in South Africa. And that 3-year delay, or however long it was responsible, according to analysis later, of 300,000 people unnecessarily dying. But the medicines were eventually rolled out, and after 10 years we have managed to get the epidemic relatively under control, and people now are living with HIV in a way that before it was a death sentence. So, in the same way, we're now in a situation of government inaction over a far more dangerous epidemic of climate change and health crisis. And it's incumbent on us not just to take the personal actions that we're asked to, such as eating less meat and flying less, driving less and cycling around, but to take political action and to get onto the streets. And so that's why I think it's great that we're here now, and that we're here telling the truth about climate change. Thank you very much. microphone here. Does anyone want to ask a question or make a comment or anything like that?
Just wondering about what observations you've had of malnutrition in the UK, possibly related to climate change, because that's where you're now working.
So right now, food is very cheap in the UK, and it's never been cheaper. And the main issues that we have in child health about malnutrition are actually overnutrition, so obesity. Food scarcity has been reported occasionally, but at the moment we have a robust social safety net, and so undernutrition in children where it exists is just been in isolated cases. But I think it's also important to remember that the massive abundance of food that we have in the UK at the moment and in the world is made possible because of sort of fossil economy, petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides and things that are actually reducing our ecology. And all of those advancements in the green revolution, such as pesticides and petrochemical fertilizers, are really quite unsustainable. And so in some ways we're living on borrowed time in that respect. And the person who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, after he won, said, what I've done has basically lent humanity a little bit of time to get ourselves under control. But I'm only delaying the problem by a few decades now. We're still pumping out CO2 with our fossil economy, and we're still making all those fertilizers. Our ability to do that won't be able to go on forever, and we're going to have to find new ways of being sustainable with our food production.
Considering the population of the world was 1 billion in the 1800s, and because of access to abundant fossil fuels, we've now got a population of 7.7 billion, and the world is growing by 89 million people per year. Isn't it about time we use the aid to help women and empower women and give them the access to family planning that we all take for granted in this country? I mean, in the global north, we have more or less stabilised our populations, but places like Niger, the average number of children per woman is 7 children. They are already malnourished. So shouldn't we be spending some of that £17 billion in aid in helping these communities stabilise their populations?
I think it's important when we're talking about world population, first of all, to make 2 points. First of all is that people in developing countries lead low carbon lives, and they are not the people who are responsible for climate change. There was a question about whether enabling low-income countries to control their populations is eugenics. I would disagree. I think it's about having people having access to reproductive rights, so being able to have control over their bodies and control over their reproductive systems. And we know that there's a strong correlation between female education and female empowerment and reduction in population. And I think that's important. I think the UN projection is that by 2050 we're going to have 9.1 billion people on the planet, 9.8 billion on the planet. So we're in this sort of paradox where the population is rising massively, but then we're also facing this these projections from climate scientists saying that by the turn of the century, the Earth's population, in the context of unmitigated climate change, may only be able to support a population of 1 billion. So then the question arises, where are all those people going to go? Question at the back. I think we've got police helicopters buzzing overhead.
I was just going to say, actually, the reproductive justice movement, as opposed to reproductive rights movement, the reproductive justice movement came out of America, founded by African American women, and that centres around right, not just to have things like contraception and abortion, but wider justice issues. That means that you have a right to a safe, clean environment, to raise your children, like and again, free from police violence, they can have sons, they're not at risk of the state, and half that, or 70% of that is climate justice, so they make very clear correlations between particularly global south being marginalised by climate change, pollution, air pollution, and these things inhibit being able to make really true
Just to comment on that, yeah. I think there's sometimes a bit of a misconception that you can just deliver contraception into a place and all the women are ready to take it up. The ground has to be fertile, that's not the word in this case, but in terms of women's education and gender inequalities as well. And it's such a complex issue. I mean, we've worked in some of these places, like sub-Saharan Africa as an example. The cultural and religious factors that are there that are stopping women, having the access that they need. In all these countries, contraception is illegal, and it's nice to think that you could go in and just deliver these health programs. But having seen them on the ground, these people are, often working against very powerful systems. My experience is in Uganda, where really the American religious movements are really funding a lot of the anti-contraception movement there. It's the same people that are really behind the anti-homosexuality movements there as well. So these are the great challenges. I mean, actually delivering these contraception. No. Addressing the under 5 mortality, really, you see fertility rates naturally decline as the under 5 mortality rates go down. So stopping, helping stop children dying from acute malnutrition, vaccination program against pneumonia and diarrheal illnesses as well. And as soon as people are confident that their 2 or 3 children might actually grow up into adolescence and economic productivity, fertility rate naturally declines. Because Uganda might be a place of records, but the fertility rate's now about 5.5. It was 8 15, 20 years ago. So it has come down. How's that under 5 mortality? It's one of the best, arguments for helping development in lots of these countries is that if we don't address under 5 mortality, the population still goes up. Paradoxically, the more children die under 5, the greater the population increase.
I've travelled a lot in Patagonia. You can go for 5 days without seeing a single village there. And parts of the world are